Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Back to you for week 9 on international agreements implemented at the national level. We won't be spending quite as much time on this topic as we do on national law and regulation, but there are some key messages that I want you to understand. Because international agreements really since 1972 and the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm, Sweden, there's been a burgeoning of international agreements to address environmental problems that are transboundary in nature. In other words, governments can't address them alone because the sources of the problem and the impacts of the problem are transboundary and that travel across national jurisdictions. International agreements have also become very, very influential. I mean, we know that since we know that around the concept of sustainable development, for example, in the publication of Our Common Future in 1987 out of the World Commission on Environment and Development. The concept of sustainable development today still holds a great deal of sway over the way we think about environmental policy and development generally. We also have seen a growth in conventions that Canada has become a signatory to and ratified. Everything from the Climate Change Convention, biodiversity, desertification, persistent organic pollutants, trade in endangered species, as well as a whole pile of regional agreements have emerged, to the point now where the international environmental governance regime is itself a potential course, and in fact I have designed full courses on this because of its complexity and the range of issues that are addressed and how they're addressed, because each individual issue will require a different treatment depending upon the nature of the subject matter. But common features of all international agreements are a signed agreement, a ratified agreement, a secretariat at the international level that manages the agreement, and various actions to enforce or to implement the agreement. The agreements typically come about in this way. One is the science of an issue begins to emerge globally. Governments decide and get together and talk about the science. They negotiate an understanding of what the science is saying. Then a decision might be taken through the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, Governing Council, or another mechanism to begin to negotiate an agreement. Preparatory committees or negotiating committees are established, which can involve 190, 200 governments will meet to begin to negotiate an agreement. That can take several meetings over 2, 3, 4, 5 years or longer to come up with the actual agreement. Agreement is reached and governments will sign that agreement. But signing that agreement in and of itself does not make a country a full member of that agreement, because conventions still need to be ratified at the national level, and that's where impacts at the national level become more pronounced. Because governments have to come home, they have to put in the regulations and other obligations that were negotiated agreement into law nationally, and typically those have to be passed through the legislative body of a country, which is in a sense passing the acceptance of the law, the international agreement, as being part of the national law. And then those are implemented nationally. For example, we have regulations on hazardous waste that are in compliance with the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste. We have regulations that address persistent organic pollutants that are in compliance with the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. We have laws on protecting of wetlands and things like that are in compliance with the appropriate international agreements, including biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So these things throw a lot onto national law, but they're the only instrument that national governments can use to address environmental problems that are transboundary in nature. For example, if we have mercury pollution in the Great Lakes, which we have, in the early days when that was discovered, a lot of that mercury was coming from Canada's own pulp and paper facilities and so on, and that was contaminating the Great Lakes. But since we brought in very strict mercury requirements in Canada, and mercury loading was still going up in the Great Lakes, where was that coming from? Well, chemical analysis illustrated that was largely coming as a transboundary movement of mercury from Asia. And that's still the case today. So how do you address that problem of transboundary nature without addressing an international agreement between countries? And that's why international agreements emerge. Plus, there's a secondary issue. Remember last week when I talked to you a little bit about leveling the playing field. In some of these areas or issues, leveling the playing field can also be important, where governments will try to use international agreements to level the playing field between industries and how they can use certain chemical compounds, or whether they can trade chemical compounds, or restricting that trade and so on. For example, if Canada was going to forgo shipping hazardous waste to developing countries, it wanted the industries in Germany or England and so on to come under the same obligations, so that all all hazardous waste exports to developing countries for final disposal was discontinued. So no one gets an advantage in managing their hazardous waste. No developing country ends up with hazardous waste that it can't properly manage itself, and so on and so forth. So there are environmental problems that need to be addressed through international agreements because they're transboundary issues, but also there's often leveling the playing field aspects associated with that. Now, it's also important to understand that there are two different kinds of international agreement. One is a hard law agreement, which is typically seen as being legally binding. In other words, governments must come back and put in place the regulations that allow them to, if they want to be a full member of the convention or the agreement, come back and enforce laws through law to implement these things. But there are also soft law agreements, which are international voluntary agreements, where governments agree on an intention to move forward on an issue. One example of a hard law would be the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. One on a soft law would be the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. Okay, and there are many types of examples in virtually all aspects of environmental policy where there's often hard law and then related soft law that preceded the hard law, or moved in to address an aspect that the hard law did not address, and a soft law was seen as the best way to proceed, or governments did not want to constrain themselves by hard law, but were willing to work towards a common goal in a soft law mechanism. There are various reasons that come into play for these different types of instruments. So it's important to understand that the international agreements in the area of the environment is a very complex web of hard law and soft law agreements addressing various aspects of that. The convention, typically when these conventions come into force, there's a convention of the parties. It's called a COP, and it's an organized body of representative of governments that make decisions about the agreement going forward. There's a secretariat that administers the convention or the agreement on behalf of the parties, and there are various implementation mechanisms. There might be regional research centers or regional implementation centers or whatever to help countries to comply with the hard law agreement. There's also a series of financial mechanisms that go into, because of course a lot of the assumption around international agreements is that wealthy countries will help developing countries to implement these agreements. For example, countries have set up the Global Environment Facility with the World Bank in Washington. The GEF is essentially a mechanism that helps developing countries through funding to implement key agreements like the convention, the climate change, biodiversity, persistent organic pollutants, desertification, ozone depleting substances, and so on and so forth. And that's called the financial mechanism or the financial instrument of the agreement. So that's also typically a part. So you have COP, the Secretariat, local implementation actions, and funding mechanisms are typically what goes on in agreements. So international agreements. So you can imagine that you've got hard law, you've got soft law, you've got agreements for different problems, and you've got a menagerie of different international activities that constitutes quite a huge international regime for the environment, because as we get more integrated globally and as problems become more transboundary, many environmental problems that are of a significant nature can only be addressed through international agreements, because environmental problems are not confined to any one nation. Climate change, obviously, is a classic example of that, right? So it's important for people to realize that this complex web both throws down onto national governments in terms of our obligations, but also national governments throw expectations and objectives up onto the international regime to achieve things that they can't achieve alone. Okay. Now in Canada, ratification is not as easy as it sounds, because a lot of the things that go into an international agreement, as we talked about in overlapping jurisdictions last week, require that provincial and municipal governments do things to help ratify. So negotiating international agreements for Canada can be quite complex, because we have to reach a national consensus that goes out to international negotiation. And then when we try to ratify, we have to ratify through more than just one government body. So the complexity can become much more difficult relative to, say, a unitary state like England or something like that. So these are the things to keep in mind in the international agreements. Keep in mind that they're likely to become far more important in the future with global integration than they are to become less. That they create obligations at the national level that get really complex, because one government might have a regime that's quite pro-environment and ratification can happen quickly. Another government might have signed but not ratified for a long time, because the political dynamics in that country, remember talking about political economy from last lecture, just aren't in place. For example, when the United States signed on initially to the Kyoto Protocol under the Climate Change Convention, that was at a time when George W. Bush was president. Well, the chance of getting that passed in the United States was next to impossible with a Republican president, Republican Congress. Whereas in Canada, we at that time had the Chrétien Liberals in place, and they were quite progressive on the environment, so we signed up. Then Prime Minister Harper comes on, looks a bit more like George W. Bush, and pulls us out of the Kyoto Protocol. So you can see that there's complex political economic dynamics around international environmental agreements as well. I don't want to go into this too much, because that's too much for the course, but it gives you a sense that, Google some of these conventions, look at what they do on their convention pages, look at their guidance to countries on how they ratify agreements, what their secretariat is doing, how they prepare for their COP meetings, the Convention of the Party meetings, and so on and so forth. Just roam around, say, the Stockholm Convention page or the Biodiversity Convention page, and you'll begin to see how these dynamics work. Okay? On that, I'll leave you for now. We'll see you again next week.